Hello everyone, welcome back to another Grim Dawn redux of the Shieldbreaker. But before we get into that, I owe you all an apology. I've been pretty lazy with my content on this channel, alright? Since I had no intention of pursuing this for money, and I still don't, I was lazy. I used excuses to keep things a bit more simplistic. This is across all my content, Smite, Grim Dawn. I curtailed my topics in the excuse that it was more intended for newer players, ignoring the obvious fact that eventually these newer players will not be so new and will want to know more. My plan at that point was to just make more videos. Honestly, this is idiotic. So we're going to do Shieldbreaker correctly. Alright, I'm going to get into the weeds of everything but specific equipment, because I'm still talking improv, alright? Because I still recommend improv to all and sundry. It's more interesting to play, in my opinion. I will talk about specific sets in the future, but let's stick with improv for now. Alright, but we're going to talk some pretty serious stuff here, from beginning to end, on Shieldbreaker. Now, when you are playing Shieldbreaker and you are improving a Shieldbreaker, you want, at minimum, two things. At minimum, you want Guardian of Empyrean, and you want Celestial Presence. Because no matter how you run Shieldbreaker, this resistance reduction is going to be effective. Now let's take a brief moment to explain resistance reduction, because I was mistaken on this, alright? Huesitos explained it beautifully. It's a simplified version of the Smite formula, basically. Smite penetration applications. The pause was for emphasis. Now, functionally, there are three types of resistance reduction that take place. This here is minus 25%, okay? Do not make my mistake. Don't multiply. If you're a math nerd, your first instinct would have been to multiply. Pembus, after all. No. Bad math nerd. You go reverse Pembus here. This is basic subtraction. If an enemy has 100% resistance, that is just a flat-out minus 25. Period. End of story. Okay? 75 resistance. Now, what is different is, and I'm going to use the example Huesitos used generously, shout out to Huesitos, this word here. There's one word that's different in Viper that is not existent in the Celestial Presence. That word is reduced. 20% reduced. That 20% is multiplied. You actually multiply this from whatever the remaining amount is, because any subtraction takes place first. Alright, remember, this is reverse Pembus. So from that 75%, you have 20% less. That totals 15. So now you're down to 60. Now let's pretend, for a hot second, Shattering Smash reduces elemental resistance instead of physical. Let's just pretend, right? That for reduced target physical resistance, that's also subtraction, because it's a flat number, it's not a percentage. So in other words, the only one that you multiply is the percentage reduction. Flat reduction like this, and anything with a subtraction sign in front of it, is just regular subtracted. But this is subtracted last. The minus sign is subtracted first. Okay? Now, Celestial Presence, regardless of how you're building, is going to be useful. I will explain why later. It's fairly obvious at surface, but it's more complicated than it looks at first glance. You will, 9 times out of 10, want Divine Mandate, because when you approach the Shieldbreaker, your predominant damage form is either going to be physical or fire. But if you're taking Shieldbreaker seriously, and I'm about to surprise you, so hold on to your butts, you don't do both. Now, once you've picked your jaw up off the floor, let me explain by using specifically the physical damage build first. Before we get into that really quick, let me talk about a misconception that is very common in the Grim Dawn community, particularly on Reddit. And I've had this discussion recently with commenters. a large portion of the Grim Dawn community insists that the only way to approach Grim Dawn is with one damage type specifically. You hyper-focus on that one damage type, you ignore everything else. This can and will shoot you in the foot, because the game is designed to have two damage types. But if you're really good about it, you can make both damage types excruciatingly powerful through the power of attributes. You see, every damage type in the game increases its damage based on one of two attributes: cunning for the physical ones, and spirit for everything else. Now, when I say physical damage types, I don't just mean physical damage. This also includes pierce and bleed as well. All three of these, and internal trauma damage, which is just physical damage over time. So, internal trauma damage, by the way, operates using the same resistances as physical damage, but that's, fun fact. Anyways, back to the point. Physical, internal trauma, bleed, and pierce all operate off of cunning. Everything else operates off of spirit. When I talked about the solo Oathkeeper, and I was talking really extensively about the interplay between the acid and vitality, that's possible because both of them run off spirit. You don't need to invest any points in cunning for them both to work. There is obviously a preference for acid damage, so you would want to use acid damage as your primary, but there is no attribute penalty for increasing vitality as well. Okay? The only real restriction on that is the difficulty of getting vitality resistance via devotion point. Acid is just a lot easier to get your hands on, so acid is going to be your primary damage type there regardless, because that resistance reduction via devotion points is easier to get into, right? But this is not the case for Shieldbreaker, most of whom's skills do physical and fire. This is a problem, because if you've been paying attention, then you've already figured out that physical is increasing off of cunning, and fire is increasing off of spirit, which makes things a bit more difficult attribute point-wise, right? And yet, I still advocate for two damage types. Why? Well, let's actually really quickly talk about a really unique issue and a really creative solution around that issue. Let's talk shield with melee, or melee with shield if you prefer that term. Pure elemental. Let's do a fire build with the melee with shield, because this is the best illustration of why I advocate for two damage types. Now, if we're going to approach this from a fire standpoint, there are two great ways of doing this. Alright, let's talk generally speaking, first off, alright? You've got a shield, and even though it gives you flat damage, let me rephrase that, this provides you with flat damage. It's plus 72% to all damage, includes the elemental damage you're about to do. Now, there are a variety of things we can do here. At this point. Sorry, I had to take a sip. The first decision you have to make is which auto attack skill you want to use, because this is going to be your predominant damage form. It's going to be cheap, it's going to be really effective, right? Now, with fire damage, with a shield, with melee, you have a decent amount of choice, because on the one hand, Righteous Fervor gives you much more burn damage than it does physical damage. And you can grab Consecration for its durability. For this example, we're going to use Righteous Fervor. This will make more sense later. We're going to get it up to here, right? Retribution is optional. You can pick this up if you really want the extra damage, whether you're doing physical or elemental damage. Retribution is a decent pickup. Sometimes I grab it, sometimes I don't. It really depends. For this example, to save on skill points, we're just going to go up to Consecration, okay? At least 1 point in Presence of Virtue. How many points past this you put in is going to depend on your equipment. General rule of thumb is the earlier in the game you are, the more points you're probably going to have in this. I typically, on average, run 3. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. Sometimes I put in all 12, right? Resilience for durability. Now, what about my damage ability, right? My serious damage ability. Well, since we're going for fire damage, the actual best option is Fire's Might, actually, because we can convert this to 100% fire damage incredibly easily. First, obviously, Volcanic Might. 100% physical damage converted to fire. Boom. All that physical damage? Fire. The internal trauma damage stays the same, but that's fine. But we also get Volcanic Stride. More fire damage, burn damage, and a larger radius. So this hits more targets in melee range. Do we need Tectonic Shift? No. But we at least want these, okay? Now from the Demolitionist side, we're doing elemental damage. So we want Flame Touched. Alright? Now, let's grab Vindictive Flame really quick first. Let's go up here. Let's grab Olzwin's Wrath. And let's go all the way up to Thermite Mine. Now, this is just for emphasis of my issue with Thermite Mine. We'll talk about this later, but we're going to have to pull up points from Resilience, go into Thermite Mine. We're still a bit short, so we'll take 2 points out of Presence of Virtue. Why have I gone this far? Well, because not a whole lot of people know this. I'm about to blow your socks off. Every damage type in the game, as of the release of this video, has a very small handful of heroes and the occasional boss that are over 100% resistant to that damage type. Every damage type but physical has this. Now, I'm going to ignore the other damage types for now, because they don't matter right now. Alright, but what I am going to talk about are the heroes and the boss that are over 100% fire resistant. They're all chthonic. And I don't mean that they're a hero of some other species that has the chthonic modifier. No. I'm talking species is chthonic. They belong to the chthonic faction. Alright? Notably, they only spawn in really late game areas, out of late game totems, and in one specific chthonic rift, namely the one in the Ashes of Malmoth content at the end of the swamp. Now, there is, if memory serves me, because I didn't actually specifically count them, but there's 4 or 5 heroes that have this, and 1 boss. The boss in question, by the way, specifically, is that fiery demon that you fight just before Ulgrim in, I believe it's the area known as Entropy in the Ashes of Malmoth DLC. Okay? Very specifically, he is the big problem. He has 108% fire resistance at base. And the other heroes have similar, and again, they tend to spawn in later game areas. You will never see any of these before the Field of Sorrows, alright? Let's be really clear. You're going to see them in the field. You might see them in the Field of Sorrows. You might see them in the Necropolis. You might see them in any of the DLC. Okay? Anywhere in the DLC that they have a chance of spawning. Alright? Is this a concern? Should we throw away fire damage? What is the issue? Well, alright, let's be practical about this. This is a subtraction resistance reduction, minus 30%. Combine this with Celestial Presence, you have minus 55%. This is going to bring them down to 63% fire resistance. Pull out the 20% from the Danger Noodle. You've got, I'm doing estimation head maths here, but I'd say, we're going to just say 10. We're going to round pretty close to 10% here, because it's going to be roughly 10% anyways, and you're going down to 53%. All of that's unnecessary. Celestial Presence is still necessary, so don't worry about that, but Thermite Mine is not necessary, even if you're going with fire damage as your primary damage type. Why? Because lightning damage exists. You see, fun fact about all of the chthonic heroes and the chthonic boss I just mentioned, their lightning resistance is ass. Specifically 10%. Alright? We have access to lightning. We have access to really delicious lightning. And that lightning, the idealized lightning, is just right around here. right here. Stunjacks. And we happen to have 12 points available to get another 3 jacks, and you can just run up to these dweebs, throw a full face full of these, dodge away, and just don't get burned too hard. Alright, on top of that, furthermore, each of these only do 3 damage types. Physical, which you're running around with a shield, relax. 2, you've got access to, of course, easy fire resistance, without even needing blast shield. 3, they do chaos damage. Now, it's pretty easy to augment the chaos damage in there. It's not even difficult to augment the fire resistance in there. Fire resistance is pretty common on equipment anyways. Even without augments, it's really not hard to counteract this. But you might be wondering, well, okay, Professor, but they're so weak to lightning damage, why wouldn't we want the Thermite mines on top of the other resistance reductions that we're using, right? Which is a valid question. But you'll also have noticed that I can blast out significantly more lightning damage by maxing full spread here, reducing their lightning resistance down to negative 15%, alright? And then just absolutely go ham with stunjacks and full spread, relying primarily on my shield and my defensive abilities to keep me alive. You don't even necessarily even need Olswin's Wrath, by the way. That's not even something you need. That's something I grabbed on the way to Thermite Mine. Realistically speaking, you can stop at full spread here. Use those 17 points to grab resilience. Maybe you throw these points into Haven to increase your ability to survive. What have you, right? This is why I recommend 2 damage types. Yes, we absolutely can reduce these villains' fire resistance down to a at least tolerable 63%. Or we can take just one hot second, grab some easy lightning damage, and then take advantage of their negative 15% lightning damage and blast them with lightning damage, because lightning scales with spirit. Okay? Again, very, very easy to exploit that. We're already increasing spirit to increase our fire damage. All we gotta do is grab some stunjacks and blast them in the face with the lightning damage. Okay? This is a really big reason why I advocate for 2 damage types, but you just have to be paying attention, right? You can't just throw any 2 damage types together. They have to kind of work. They have to flow out of the same attribute, okay? Otherwise, it's much harder to pull off. Is it possible? Absolutely. Is it recommended? Hell no. Okay? But this is the clearest example that I can come up with of why you really want 2 different damage types. You just need to be cautious about combining the damage. What damages are you combining here, right? So, that's a conversation on Elemental. Now, I mentioned Thermite Mine very specifically here with the shield first, because out of all of the different ways you can play Shieldbreaker, with a shield is the most consistent way of getting Thermite Mine to remain consistently effective. I mentioned this in the original version of this video, which will have been deleted when this goes up, but the problem I have with Thermite Mine from a practical function standpoint is that enemies aren't going to be standing on it long if you're more mobile. And if you're any ranged character, you're going to be more mobile because you don't want people meleeing you as a ranged character. That's fairly obvious. Two-handed weapon users or people using an offhand might have more trouble surviving than somebody with a shield, obviously. So the shield is helping you to really stay alive. And if you don't like shields because they're unreliable, that's just a matter of not investing enough in devotion points for that, which is totally your choice. That's fine. But if you're willing to invest the devotion points to make your shield consistently effective at blocking, you can really stretch Thermite Mine to its limit here, alright? But again, that is the very specific context of using a shield. The rest of the builds and topics I'll be covering in this video are less capable of maximizing the potential of Thermite Mine, to the point where that elemental resistance that you're getting, or the elemental resistance subtraction you're getting out of Thermite Mine, frankly, isn't going to be terribly consistent, okay? It's a pretty big risk. So this is why I don't generally recommend Thermite Mine, even for a melee with shield, who is the idealized scenario for Thermite Mine, okay? Furthermore, again, some people have mentioned Blast Shield. Blast Shield is nice, do not misunderstand me, but it's just not necessary to deal with the enemies that you really need to deal with, which are the ones with abnormally high fire resistance, which you don't need Blast Shield for, right? So this is a elemental approach to shield with melee, alright? But that's not how I prefer to play shield with melee, okay? Now, how I play shield with melee is I go for physical damage, alright? And there are a couple of reasons for this. We'll talk about stun jacks in a hot second. The big reason is Shattering Smash. We are already on our way to Celestial Presence, which is at the end of the Oathkeeper skill tree. So putting the full 10 points in Shattering Smash just makes getting that physical resistance reduction really easy. Okay? Secondarily, we have really interesting access to Presence of Virtue, which gives us a internal trauma and bleeding damage. Technically, I should be saying internal trauma or bleeding damage, but that's irrelevant for a second. And we can have a really grand old time with that, but let's really quickly talk skills. Now, when I'm running a physical Shieldbreaker, what abilities I'm running tends to vary based on the context. If I'm building this Shieldbreaker to run through the Shattered Realm, I'm running Virus Might, just the first stage fully capped, just for all that damage. Okay? Right off the top. Then I'm either going for Judgment if I'm playing with other people, because Judgment at max ranks is going to really pull a lot of enemy attention away. It's going to knock down people. It's going to be fantastic. Or, if I'm playing by myself, I'm probably running the Aegis of Menhir. Okay? Obviously, we'd be having the Avenging Shield. I typically pull points out of Resilience so I can cap Avenging Shield so I can get the most amount of damage out of this. I find that very important. Whether or not you want to go that far is up to you, but I'll usually run the good old Aegis of Menhir if I'm alone, but if I'm playing with friends, I'll go for Judgment, because you really don't need Crushing Verdict. It is nice, but you don't need it. But you, again, can get this. If you can get away with this, that's great. But I can typically do Virus Might. Or maybe I don't put the full points into Virus Might. Maybe I go instead with... I leave 1 point in Virus Might, and I don't go with Aegis of Menhir. I do go with Judgment. Right? And I can go with Crushing Verdict. Now you'll remember that I left the points into Stun Jacks. This is because Stun Jacks is another one of those really interesting skills for Shieldbreaker, where regardless of how you're building, Stun Jacks is going to be pretty consistently effective, although I personally prefer it for melee builds. It's something that you can have in there until you know what you want to use, or if you're not sure how you want to run this, Stun Jacks is going to be pretty reliable, right? It's one of those, regardless of how you play, this is a useful type item, right? Because it's doing physical and lightning damage, so whether you decide to go for the elemental build, which, again, is more important for it to grab lightning as its secondary damage type, because that also scales off of spirit, then Stun Jacks is going to be really effective there. If you decide to go for the physical, or for a physical build, Stun Jacks has that too, right? Not really an issue. So Stun Jacks is going to be consistently effective regardless of how you build this. You don't need to use it, please do not misunderstand me. But again, if you're unsure, or if you want something that's going to be useful, even if you flip-flop between different builds, Stun Jacks is going to be there for you, and it's going to remain effective. Even if you're ranged, you've got these 6 jacks flying out there, potentially stunning a large series of monsters. You've got a lot of damage output with these in melee range, right? Absolutely consistently effective item, right? But again, you don't need these. Now, the final burning question here is Fire Strike to Righteous Fervor. I only talked about half of this. I talked about how Righteous Fervor is more defensive thanks to Consecration. Fire Strike originally looks a little weaker, right? But first off, that plus 50% physical damage is scaling primarily off of the, weapons that... Now, this physical damage increase here, the plus 50% physical damage, is supposed to be running off the weapon damage, right? Because there is no built-in physical damage on Fire Strike. That's what it's intended for right here, is the actual physical damage of the weapon, right? As a result of this, to be really brutally honest, early game, Righteous Fervor is going to be more impactful. It has physical and burn damage built in that it's increasing beyond just the weapon itself. The weapon, that's actually why the physical damage is lower here, right? The reason for that is because the bulk of weapons in the game are physical damage dealing, right? But what differentiates Righteous Fervor and Consecration from Fire Strike is not just the fact that Consecration here, as the second node, increases a lot of your defensive stats and your attack speed for a fun extra bit, but we also have Explosive Strike on Fire Strike, which gives your auto attacks an AoE, whether they're ranged or melee, which makes controlling crowds a lot easier. Now, in the base game, this doesn't make a huge difference. This seems slightly more important to me because I've noticed since the most recent update there seems to be a small increase in the number of enemies on screen. Family members of mine who also play Grim Dawn have also noticed this, so this is not just an independent conclusion on my part. This is something family members that I play with have also mentioned, right? So this is slightly more useful now, in my opinion, than it used to be. But where this really shines is in specifically those modded games that increase the number of enemies by themselves, right? Obviously, that goes without saying. Whereas with games that mod enemies' stats, Consecration is going to be more useful. Consecration is also a better idea in hardcore for pretty obvious reasons, right? But specifically, which skills you really want to use as a melee shield using Shieldbreaker is going to be totally up to you, okay? You can use Aegis of Men here for the distance, the consistent 4 to 5 targets hit. You can use Judgment if you're trying to taunt enemies to you, if you've got allies. You can absolutely use Vire's Might for damage beyond just the movement speed. You could choose to use Stun Jacks, or you might not. Totally up to you. I do recommend Vindictive Flame, though, because you are going to be in that melee range. It is increasing all of your speeds, including your casting speed, your attack speed, and your movement speed, obviously. It is doing consistent damage output to enemies nearby. It gives you retaliation, it gives you health regeneration, right? It's just so lovely, even on a physical build, that I build this almost every time, right? It's just absolutely glorious. But whether you go for Fire Strike or Righteous Fervor depends somewhat on your needs, slightly on the equipment you have, and decently partially on your personal preference, okay? Now let's talk devotions. Alright, so when you're running devotions on melee with Shieldbreaker, you have to make a decision, okay? You have to decide whether or not you're going to go full damage or if you're going to go into a hybrid of defense and damage, okay? Why? Well, primarily because it is very, very difficult to get the resistance devotion powers for both the damage types that you'd be doing. For physical, this is pretty specifically the secondary damage type, which is the bleed from Huntress. This isn't really possible. Alright, let me set up the physical damage first, right? We obviously need Assassin's Blade, right? This is pretty self-explanatory. Again, we're going to slap this on Guardian of Empyrean. Keynote, though, again, you need to level up this power first. It has 25 levels. It doesn't start at minus 32% physical resistance. You have to level it up to that, right? Slap it on anything you have until you get the Guardians, all right? Now we'll grab the hammer for a nice, quick, clean 4 purple. And we get physical internal trauma damage increases. We'll grab the anvil for 5, right? We'll go on ahead and put Targo's hammer on Presence of Virtue here. You know, we have a shield, physical internal trauma damage, 5 purple, physical internal trauma damage and armor throughout the anvil. It's great, right? We're trying to get to Olrun. We're going to go on ahead and grab the owl, right? That's lovely. We're looking for some more yellow. We're looking for some more purple. All right. Well, we also want to be grabbing, for the purposes of convenience later, Harvestman's Scythe. So we'll grab the turtle because we have our shield, of course. Right, we're going to put that on resilience. Now, this is important because turtle shell triggers at 50% health, and resilience automatically triggers at 66% health. They trigger very close together. In a lot of cases, especially late game or in modded games, these are going to trigger simultaneously, right? So that's not really a huge concern there. Okay. Now, for the purposes of this example, what we're going to do is just grab the stag really quick for physical bleed damage. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Don't worry too much about that. We'll also grab the bull for kicks, right? We'll put this on Vir's Might for laughs. And now, of course, we are 3 away from the purple here. We grab the Harvestman's Scythe, right? And then we have Olrun, where we'll go up to 4 points, say. Now, if we're going to grab... Actually, let me stop here really quick. The way I've set this up right now, as we stand, is it is incredibly easy to either grab Obelisk of Menhir for additional defensive stats, or we can spring for the Huntress very easily. And this is going to depend on what you want to do. Now, I personally prefer the Obelisk of Menhir. I have a shield. I would like to capitalize on that shield, right? Purely personal preference. If you really want to do the damage and still use the shield, go for the Huntress. I'm going to show you getting the Huntress really quick, alright? Because this is a fairly straightforward and easy process. We grab the Falcon here. We're going to put this on Righteous Fervor in this example, right? Now we have just 1 shy of the green, which we can just get through here, through the crossroads, and then we need 3 red. And we can get this through the Night Talon, right? And now we just need 1 more red. This is easy. Boom. And with this, we can grab part of the Huntress. We can pull the points out of the Harvestman's Scythe specifically. You could take it out of the Owl as well. Do keep that in mind. Alright, I prefer... I'm taking it out of the Harvestman's Scythe in this sample because primarily it's more points, right? We can do a little bit more with these last 2 points. We can finish Olrun, for instance. We can grab Internal Trauma. We can grab the physical bleed damage. We can grab Blind Fury if you really want, right? That's totally up to you. But we have Rend, right? We're going to put this on Stun Jacks for this sample, right? And even if we went for Blind Fury, we could very easily put this on Shattering Smash, which is, you know, not ideal, of course. You might maybe put Falcon Swoop on that instead. Totally up to you. Maybe you've got Aegis of Menhir. I haven't set this up to have Aegis of Menhir, but maybe you have that instead, right? We're putting Shattering Smash here as just a sample. In reality, you would probably have Aegis of Menhir or something else along those lines, right? But you've got these, right? And of course, you can grab the physical bleeding damage, and you're reducing enemies' bleed resistance and enemies' physical resistance. Now, this isn't necessary per se, right? And what's actually terribly interesting is if you do this right, let's pull this 1 point out here, because technically speaking, you can put this point here, and we can pull the points out of the Owl, and we can actually maximize Olorin, and then maybe put the points back into the Owl to get the elemental resistance and reduced skills. You could put 2 points into the Harvestman's Scythe here. You could put 2 points in anything, really. You could put it in the Lion, for Pete's sakes. Health, defensive abilities, some Spirit here, in case you need a little bit of free Spirit. Maybe you want to go for the Lotus. Totally possible as well. 30 health. 80 health here, plus 4% energy, or you can go for the healing effects. Maybe you put it in the Shield Maiden for a little bit of defense, right? You can grab this right here, get 20 defensive ability, plus 20% shield damage blocked, and go down here for increased internal trauma damage, right? Totally possible. But you can do this very, very easily. You can see where we're really not having a hard time here. We can even pull out the green to go for more points here, because of course the Huntress is filling in her own green functionally. So we can pull that out. We have 3 points available. You can absolutely go ham on the Lion if you really wanted to. Not even a problem, right? You could complete the entirety of the, not the Owls, the Lizard if you really wanted to get all of those stat increases, right? And you can also see where we're very close but not quite to the Obelisk here, right? And that's... You might be thinking, Professor, you're so close. Surely you can do this. Well, think about it, right? Look at the options here. We have all of this, right? And we would still need to maintain the 8 yellow on top of that. So even if we were to drop, say, the Tortoise to get the Lion and, say, for instance, the Eel here, as an example, you would still be actually spending 1 more point, because the Lion is 3, the Eel is 3, the Tortoise, or the Turtle, is 5, right? That isn't going to work, okay? But you could instead, alternatively, instead of going for the Huntress, you could just grab the Obelisk, right? Instead of going for... Well, she's self-fulfilling at this point, so we ironically need to put in a green here. But you could just go for, of course, the... Oh, that's right, she's still supporting the all-run for this moment. Anyways, you're just so very close, but yet so far, because there's not really any affinity combination I've ever tried that can get you to Obelisk of Menhir, Olorin, and the Huntress, all told, right? At least not at this time. So, we have that, right? There is, of course, and we've seen the physical with the Obelisk before. Again, this is going to depend on your personal preferences. Do you want to be a bit more defensive? Get the Obelisk. Do you want to be a bit more aggressive? Get Rend from the Huntress. The same thing kind of almost exists with the Fire. Let me exemplify this. Kind of almost, but not really, because you can actually run the bulk of the Fire with the Obelisk. That's not that difficult. We would start with the Viper here. We would then grab the Vulture. And we would grab a single green, go into the Spider, right? Then we could grab the Soleil's Witchblade. We would slap that onto Guardian of Empyrean, right? We have our red. We just need the remaining green, right? And the remaining green is not that difficult to get. Alright, we can get this in a couple of different ways. I like to go Scholar's Light for increased elemental damage, because again, I'm normally going both fire and lightning. And maybe you grab, I don't know, the Crow, for instance. Right, that's acceptable. We'll use the Crow for example purposes here, and then we'll just go on ahead and put some points into the Oldswin's Torch, and then we talk about getting to the Obelisk of Menhir, which, of course, we would be using a shield, so we have the Tortoise. Right, we slap that on Resilience again because we can. You can see we're getting a bit closer to that yellow. Not really a huge deal. We could theoretically, actually, if we're feeling particularly spicy, grab the Lotus. Single green point here. Drop the Crow. I'm sorry, it's the Raven. Boom, 15 green. We've got some yellow here. This is fine. Grab the Lion. Right, because we don't have the physical damage, we don't need the bull, we don't need the stag, right? And by the way, while I'm thinking about it, actually, quick point, I used the stag in the previous example of the physical with the bleeding damage. If you don't want to focus on the bleeding damage that much, you can go with the bull instead if you really want to. If you want more defensive status instead of the bull, you can 100% go for the Solemn Watcher. That's really not difficult to get your hands on either. You have that option as well. But the Solemn Watcher is very much non-shield associated defensive stats, armor, chaos resistance, pierce resistance, all the good stuff, right? All the things you'll love to see. But anyways, we have our 8 yellow there, right? Because the lion is giving us health, defensive abilities, spirit, which we love, 15% all damage, just a great bunch of stats. And we have, of course, really easy ways of getting to the 15 blue. We grab the eel, we grab the lizard, boom, there is the obelisk of men here. We go on ahead and put some points into that. We get stone form, put that on divine mandate, and we can absolutely finish off with a delightful meteor storm. Easy as pie, right? So, functionally, you'll notice that here, again, we've got a lot of fire damage, but we really haven't done anything with lightning, specifically. Right, the most we've done is grab Scholar's Light, because going for the Widow would be a bit difficult. Why would it be a bit difficult? Well, you can see how extremely close we are to just not having the points we need, right? We're very close here. We'll actually pull out the red here really quick, right? Let's go on a hypothetical. You can theoretically do this. It's just very difficult. We'll pull some points out of the obelisk temporarily. We're going to grab the Widow here. Alright, just for the lightning resistance, for example purposes. We'll put that on Vir's Might for here. Right? You can see where we have all these points, right? We got to put one in blue. Whoops. One in the blue here. Pull out the lizard. Put the points from the lizard into Obelisk of Men here. Now you'll notice we've lost stone form, but we now have the lightning resistance. Again, you can run this for the full damage. We've also lost a little bit of fire damage out of Olzwin's Torch. Right? You can run both these resistance reductions. Should you? That's a matter of personal preference. That really depends on how important you think it is to reduce enemies' lightning resistance. Now, I don't personally find it that vitally important. I'd rather have the defensive stats, right? But that is my preference. Realistically, again, while your preference is the significant factor, do keep in mind a couple of things. Again, if we are talking about increased enemy numbers, it might be more helpful to have the arcane bombs lying around, because they are going to be decreasing that resistance, which helps you clear enemy waves a little bit easier, which might be more important. But if we're talking about any other context outside of a modded game with increased enemy numbers, it's pure preference. Because even if you're talking about a game modded with increased enemy stats, while the increased lightning resistance reduction would be good, so would the increased defensive stats, because they're going to be hitting you harder, right? So you've got that going on. And then, of course, if we're talking hardcore, on the one hand, the defensive stats are obviously going to help keep you alive, and that's the priority in hardcore, right? So it partially depends on what kind of game you're playing, which, you know, whether or not you've modded it, if you're doing hardcore. But for the most part, this is going to come down to personal preferences, right? It is, of course, as you'll probably have noticed, possible to get the lightning resistance reduction and the fire resistance reduction and get decent points into Obelisk of Men here. It was not possible for the bleed physical, right, to run all these at the same time. Why? So why is it not possible for physical and bleed to get both of those resistance reductions and still run Obelisk of, at least part of Obelisk of Men here and part of Ulrin? Well, it comes down to the really simple fact that Huntress requires 4 green, 3 red. Okay? And in order to do this, you need a dedicated constellation with a high enough affinity to do this efficiently. But you don't. Even if we were to use, say, the bat, for instance, 2 red, 3 green, it's still 1 less of both that we need. So you would still need a point in crossroads and a point in... the point in green crossroads and the point in red crossroads. That is 7 points, right? And if you look back, that's just not going to happen here. Alright, there's no real way of getting all of that together. You can get real close, but it's not currently possible, right? At least not in any combination that I've ever personally discovered, and I've tried a bunch of different ways, okay? So, it just isn't going to work. But these are also the constellations that you're primarily going to be looking at for the bulk of the improv builds for Oathkeeper. The only real change you'll be making is ignoring anything shield-based for the other ways of using the Shieldbreaker. Now, speaking of other ways of using the Shieldbreaker, everything I've just said about the melee with shield largely applies to the melee with Offhand. Why? Well, primarily because with the inclusion of Safeguard, the shield kind of acts like an Offhand anyways that can block, right? Offhands increase offensive stats a lot of the time and to a higher degree than shields, but shields are typically going to give you at least some stats. Add in Safeguard, giving you plus 72% all damage and 38 flat physical damage. It's roughly equivalent. If you do use offhands, right, let's talk offhands for a hot second. We wouldn't have Safeguard, we wouldn't have Smite, and we would not be able to run Shattering Smash, obviously, right? Furthermore, Haven is off the board because you don't have a shield, so you'd only be using half of Haven anyways, so what's the point, right? Outside of that, it's going to functionally be the same. Now, fun fact though, because offhands typically increase offensive stats significantly, and because your main hand weapon is obviously still a single hand melee weapon, you're actually a little bit better off relying more on non-weapon damage scaling effects. Stunjacks is a little bit stronger typically with an offhand. There are exceptions, obviously. But in the average scenario, because of the way offhands typically increase stats, Stunjacks is going to be a little more powerful if your offhand is good, in the same way that Vire's Might wouldn't itself be a strong contender because we are not adding that shield damage, but Judgment might be a better contender, right? As would Crushing Verdict. Obviously, we also wouldn't have access to Aegis of Men here, which is noteworthy, but in an offhand case, the significant change is, instead of relying a little bit more on the weapon damage skills, which is normally what you would want because they scale to the late game a little bit better in most situations, this changes with offhands, who typically give you pretty substantial increases to specific damage types depending on the offhand, and that's really what you want to be taking advantage of there, right? And obviously, for the devotion points, right, let me undo these, you wouldn't even be looking at Obelisk of Men here. You would be running the full damage version, right, that I showed you earlier for the physical. I didn't show you the full damage fire version, which is worthy of note. We obviously would still grab the Viper, right? We would be grabbing Scholar's Light. We would be grabbing the Quill, okay? We would not be grabbing the Hydra in this case. We're melee, right? But we still need red, we still need green. We would be grabbing the Fiend, because we're looking for that spicy elemental damage, right? And now we're closer to that red there that we need. And you've got a couple of options for that, right? Specifically, this, if you can get to it, if you really want to, is pretty nice, and that's not too difficult to get your hands on, right? We have the 3 blue from the Viper. We put a single blue here. We can get our hands on the Widow, right? And we can get our hands on the Messenger of War if we really wanted to. We'll talk about that in a second. We also have some other options, right? We'll go for the Ghoul for example reasons. We'll grab the Slail's Witchblade here because we need that fire resistance. We can take out the Crossroads there. You can see we have the 8 red precisely. We're just 3 away with the green. We'll throw on the Magi for kicks, right? We'll just have ourselves a fun time with that. Go on ahead and max Olswin's Torch. Right? That's lovely. And we can also go on ahead and grab the Messenger of War if we really want to. We can pull this point out, and we have 2 points to do whatever we want with. That's totally up to you. I typically throw it into the spider and get myself some attack speed usually, is something I'm fond of doing, so this is my favorite one. But if you want, say, offensive ability for better crits, or more reliable crits, let me rephrase that, or the 3% increase to spirit because you are using 2 elemental damage types, it's totally up to you, right? I just like the attack speed and the defensive ability. That's a me thing. But you can do this. You don't have to go for the Messenger of War. You can go for something else. You could, instead of going for the Ghoul, you could run the Vulture, which would give you better defensive stats, right? Because the Ghoul is a bit more aggressive. We've got health regeneration. We've got physique here, right? Spirit, which is nice. We have attack damage converted to health, and we have the lovely Ghoulish Hunger, which is increasing your attack speed. It's converting damage to health. It's a magical time. Again, down to your preference. You can go Ghoul. You can go Vulture. Totally up to you. Magi has a great amount of fire damage, right? Easy to build in here. And this is what I would typically recommend, something along these lines, for offhand users, right? You're looking to maximize that damage, and you can absolutely go ham with this. Again, the significant change here is that you don't have access to the shield, so there's a couple of passives you can't get. Not a huge deal. But even then, I still wouldn't recommend Thermite Mine because you've taken away a lot of your durability, you've taken away a decent number of your defensive options. It's harder to withstand the incoming damage, to stand there and face tank and fight these people off with Thermite Mine. It's harder to do, right? It just is. Is it possible? Absolutely. Don't mistake my statement of difficult for impossible. That is an easy confusion many people throughout history have made, including myself. It still can work, it's just a pain in the neck. And again, throwing in lightning damage is the large solution to most of your problems. Super bosses, with their approximately 90% fire resistance, give or take 5 either way, are still going to not take as much damage from lightning. Obviously, they have decent lightning resistance at worst. But still, unless you're specifically building to take out super bosses in an abnormally quick way, you're not going to need Thermite Mine, right? It's easier and, in my opinion, more effective to splash in some easy lightning damage and run ham with that. Now, this is a really great time to talk about conversions, because conversion prefixes and suffixes on rare weapons is something worth talking about. Now, the whole point of running Improv is that you are able to adapt to the stuff that is dropping for you, the equipment that is dropping for you, on mostly the fly, right? It's not that difficult. Well, with the introduction of so many keywords that can generate on rare items, or if you're lucky, double rare items, you actually have a decent selection to work with in terms of conversion. And the glorious thing about running specifically to damage types is that you have a bit more leeway with that conversion. For example, if we were to do a physical bleed build, running that bleed off of constellation powers, it would be totally acceptable for an item to spawn that converts fire damage to either physical or bleed. Obviously, for practical purposes, it can't convert physical to burning, right? Or bleed to fire specifically. Bleed would have to convert to burning. But you know the example I'm getting here. It's perfectly acceptable to have that fire/burning damage convert to either physical or bleed, right? That is fine. And the most common keywords on items that drop involve physical damage, either converting into or converting out of. Now, for the physical bleed, that's not a huge deal, right? But what is a really interesting thing is when you build elementally, which is the slightly easier way to run everything that isn't melee with shield, you've actually got a third option for your conversion. You could convert your physical damage to fire, ideally, or lightning, second best choice. But if you're desperate, and you pick up an item that converts your physical damage to elemental damage, well, it's not the best, but, you know, it does the job, right? So you have this beautiful third option. I say beautiful, it's not really, it's kind of ugly, but you have this acceptable third option of elemental damage to convert your physical damage into, which works in a pinch, right? Incidentally, by the way, if you're using a gun, you don't have Vindictive Flame, right? We'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. But if you are using a melee weapon with Offhand, you really want Vindictive Flame. And a lot of what I've just talked about with the shield with melee and the Offhand with melee also applies to single-hand gun with either shield or the Offhand. The only significant change is, again, even with a shield, the gun is going to be a little bit less inclined to physical because Shattering Smash requires a melee weapon. But one quick moment before I forget, because I did not mention this, but an Offhand with a single-hand melee weapon is actually a decent baseline for Eye of Reckoning. It's acceptable for the shield as well, because again, the shield is increasing up to 72% of your damage there, so you can also do this with a shield as well. But if you want to run single-hand melee with either a shield or an Offhand, that works quite well, okay? And that can work really well whether you're doing a physical or a fire version. You can do a spin to win physical damage, or a spin to win fire damage, or elemental damage if you want to go whole hog and go into Soulfire. That is also a possibility. Obviously, with the nature of the way guns work, because this requires a melee weapon, you can't do that with guns. But it is noteworthy that you can do a spin to win with a shield or an Offhand with single-hand melee weapons. And it's still decently effective. But with guns, I do make a bit of a different recommendation here, alright? I don't recommend Righteous Fervor for gunplay, okay? I encourage Fire Strike. There are a couple of reasons for this, okay? First off, you have, if you're really looking to get into this, and there are additional reasons for going this far up, you can grab Static Strike. You have a chance of lightning damage, you have a chance of knockdown. This is going to help keep you alive. But this is not the only reason why this can be really nice. Okay? Second reason is, again, if you're going for elemental single-hand gun, and this, by the way, really quick note, this also applies to two-handed guns. We'll talk about the one difference between two-handed guns and gun with shield in a bit. But if you're using a gun, Static Strike is really good, and so is Granado. Especially since you can convert all 1.4 to 1.7 thousand damage, physical damage, all that, 100% conversion to lightning damage right here with Skyfire Granado. Boom, done. Now you may be wondering, well, Professor, can't I do the same thing with Canister Bomb? But note an interesting distinction here. This says pierce damage and fire damage. This says 33% of physical damage converted to lightning damage. The physical damage comes here, out of the internal trauma, technically speaking, right? So, unless there's some kind of error or something that I don't know about, and it's tough for me to test this without breaking into the game code, which I'm not really fond of doing right at this moment, this doesn't convert. That is pierce damage, fire damage, and physical damage that doesn't exist getting converted to lightning damage. Now, I suspect this is a typo. It's supposed to be the pierce damage. My rough tests indicate this is the case, but I could also just be, that could just be wishful thinking. If somebody would like to test this by breaking into the game code or something and confirm this down below, I would appreciate that. But I believe it is working as intended. They just accidentally used physical damage here as the word instead of pierce damage, which it should have been in the first place. But I don't know if this might be a Grim Tools thing as well. Right, I'm having a hard time remembering off the top of my head. But if somebody could confirm that down below, this is the only part of this video that I'm not 100% sure on. Either way, I still don't really recommend Canister Bomb for a couple of reasons. One, this chance to stun caps at 25% chance to stun, okay? This is the exact same odds you have of knocking down someone, but this is significantly cheaper and is attached to every single one of your auto attacks, right? This has a cooldown. This is less reliable. Granado, yes, also has a cooldown, but that is a 100% chance to knock down enemies affected. Now, obviously not every enemy can be knocked down. That's obvious, right? Very obvious indeed. But those enemies that can be knocked down, you can do so with Granado, blasting them with some nifty lightning damage, and then focus fire on the guys that can't be knocked down, right? Or you can wait for them to get into melee range, throw a full spread in their face, and dodge away, which is a really good time. Alright? Now, the only difference between a two-handed gun and a single-hand gun is access to shields. If you're using an offhand with a single-hand gun, all of this also applies. But if you're using a shield, you can splash in Safeguard, obviously, right? And another fun, interesting wombo combo is Aegis of Menhir with a single-hand gun. This doesn't sound like you would normally want this, but because the Aegis of Menhir typically is bouncing from 4 to 5 people once you grab Avenging Shield, this is actually a really effective way of stunning 4 or 5 enemies in a group coming at you pretty consistently from a safe distance, and then fire away using Static Strike and knocking them down after the fact. That's pretty consistent, okay? You wouldn't want Vire's Might with a gun of any variety, so at least not typically. There are exceptions to that, but they don't exist in Shieldbreaker, in my opinion. That's a conversation for a different video. But, you know, you could easily grab Aegis of Menhir and run it that way, right? That is very easy. It's very effective. And combine that with the Glorious Granado and the Static Strike, and between Static Strike, Granado, and the Aegis of Menhir, you can keep most enemies at bay for surprisingly long periods of time, right? The reason I don't recommend Righteous Fervor into Consecration is primarily because, to be brutally honest, you're less in need of this, right? It's the same reason you don't necessarily need Vindictive Flame when using a gun. Can you use both of these? Absolutely. At the end of the day, Righteous Fervor is still doing damage and increasing your attack speeds. That's really nice to see, especially with Static Strike. For Vindictive Flame, same scenario. You're increasing your attack speed, and that's good for Static Strike, right? Well, obviously, with Righteous Fervor's attack speed increase, that's not going to trigger Static Strike because you'd be using Righteous Fervor. Brief brain cramp on my part. But Vindictive Flame is nice when it's in conjunction with Static Strike, okay? But because you're also not trying to spend time in melee range a lot of the time, Vindictive Flame's other effects aren't really activating. I mean, the health regeneration obviously does, right? But the rest of this does not. It's not going to be doing damage to very many people because not very many people are going to be winding up next to you a lot of the time, right? It's the same kind of thing for Consecration. While there are enemies that have ranged attacks and the armor and elemental resistance and defensive ability will be handy there, these are also easy to see coming and dodge even without the dodge feature, as any long-time ranged player in Grim Dawn can tell you. There's not a lot of fast projectiles in this game. I think really only crossbowmen have fast projectiles. Even archers' arrows aren't what I would call that quick, right? But that's the large difference there. You otherwise do want to treat them pretty similarly, and I mean, again, with the exception of not necessarily wanting Vire's Might or Judgment, you can also build very similar skills. It's very easy. Again, it is incredibly easy to switch weapon types and retain a lot of these skills. Alright, you could go from a two-handed gun with, say, Searing Might to bopping to a melee with shield and grabbing Safeguard instead. Maybe you drop this whole line, right? You go for Righteous Fervor instead because you picked up this really spicy weapon that increases Righteous Fervor, massively boosts its fire damage, and you're off to the races, right? Lovely. Absolutely lovely. And for two-handed melee, it's quite the opposite. For two-handed melee, I do prefer to use Righteous Fervor, because you, again, don't have access to any kind of defense increases, so Consecration comes in very handy for a two-handed melee, right? Vindictive Flame also can be quite the lifesaver in these situations. You don't want Granado for melee anything, because even though it is nice to have enemies knocked onto the floor, the way Granado works is they're all going to splash out in a radius away from Granado, right? Now, one or two of these is likely to land near you, and you can slap them down, just get rid of them. And you probably will have Vire's Might, at least one point in Vire's Might. And given how long enemies remain knocked down for, at minimum, 2.8 seconds, it's not too difficult to, say, blast a enemy flunky that landed next to you, and then Vire's Might to some second chump, and maybe have enough time to run to the next guy before he stands up. But instead, you could just chuck out a bunch of full spread. The enemy isn't moving, they might get stunned, but they're not moving, and you can continue wailing on them right afterwards without the need for Virus Might to even be involved in the first place, whether or not you have it, right? So I don't really like Granado for melee builds, and I don't really recommend it for melee builds because it is, to some extent, counterproductive, right? But again, Vindictive Flame, maybe Ulzwin's Wrath if you're feeling really nervous. Ulzwin's Wrath is, I mentioned this before with the physical version, but I generally only bust out Ulzwin's Wrath if I'm looking for that elemental damage anyways. We're doing both fire and lightning, which is great, right? We're running, obviously, Flame Touched. But for physical builds, I wouldn't even go Ulzwin's Wrath. You're going to save more points by skipping over Ulzwin's Wrath, going thoroughly into Vindictive Flame, and then just focusing on the physical damage. Again, Virus Might, regardless of whether you're going elemental or physical, Virus Might is going to be really potent, because you are, again, looking at just 230% of your weapon damage. Two-handed melee weapons are the strongest weapons in the game on average. This is the physical version, again, for fire, Volcanic Might, Volcanic Stride. You're going to be absolutely crushing people with this a lot of the time, right? And that works out really well, right? We wouldn't have this for two-handed melee. And then you would just go about using whatever skills you wanted. Again, for this particular sample, we might go Righteous Fervor, right? Go into Consecration to get a little bit more durable because we don't have a shield. We keep the Delicious Full Spread because we can just blast people with that, right? We grab our Vindictive Flame. Let's do an elemental version, right? Let's go on ahead and splash that in there. Let's roll with this, right? We can absolutely do that. And then, yeah, we'll go for Flame Touched, right? Sure. Now, if you wanted to spin to win, first off, you're going to cap Presence of Virtue, but the only difference from this would be instead of Full Spread, which is, again, really useful in most builds, most Shieldbreaker builds, you can just go to the spin to win, right? Not at all a problem. Lovely. Absolutely delicious. And then for your last 6 points, you can do really whatever you want. We'll leave these 6 points open because maybe you instead go for all of this, right? The Fire Strike, that's, again, totally a matter of preference. Maybe you want to, I don't know, go for Ascension for some emergency revival. But you might be wondering, well, why did you pull out the Stun Jacks for Eye of Reckoning if they're so broadly useful across improv builds? Well, primarily because in order to use Stun Jacks, you kind of have to stop spinning, all right? So you might be wondering, Professor, why keep Virus Might then? Well, Virus Might is just to get you there, alright? Basically, the dream here is to Virus Might your way into a group, blast them right off the top with some great damage, and then spin until somebody stops moving, either you or them. Basically, right? And that's just the dream. We only really max Presence of Virtue to maximize our energy regeneration rate, which will allow us to spin longer. Alright, because the dream is, we spin till they die. Then you Virus Might to the next group, spin more. Right? That's basically what it is. You're basically a large pinball, a bladed pinball. Okay? That's kind of how you have to think of that. It's a fun time. Glorious in Shattered Realm. If you're not facing off against something with absurd elemental resistance. Right? That is a conversation that demands happening. But even then, you still wouldn't necessarily want Thermite Mine, for different reasons than the other ones, right? In an elemental shield melee, Thermite Mine is very effective. I prefer physical because it's already right there. It's really easy to get into. You don't have to go out of your way for it, right? Piece of cake. For ranged builds, it's too hard to keep the enemy on that for a long enough period of time for that to really matter, that resistance drop to really make a big difference, right? Very difficult. For two-hand melee, you can keep them there, but you have a lot less defensive stats. You don't have access to the Obelisk of Menhir or a lot of the constellations leading up to it because you don't really have, say for example, the turtle. You don't have a shield, right? So you're more fragile, and a lot of the times you're still going to need to relocate pretty damn quick, even if you've got them fighting on the Thermite Mine. You could do a full throttle, balls to the wall conflict where you're just basically trying to desperately out-damage the enemy, which is fine if that's how you want to play, but it's risky, right? At the end of the day, even those enemies that have absurdly high fire resistance are really weak to some other element, all right? In this case, lightning, right? All of these, well, okay, I can't say all of them because, again, the super bosses kind of contradict that, but the bulk of enemies who are hyper-resistant to one damage type, and there's around a half dozen heroes/bosses that are, for every damage type except physical, they're all really weak to a decent number of other damage types. I mean, I mentioned that the Chthonic guys with over 100% fire resistance or only have 10% resistance to lightning. They only have 5% resistance to cold, alright? It's not a lot. And this is on Ultimate I'm talking about. I'm not talking about baseline. I'm not talking about veteran or regular or even elite. I am talking Ultimate, okay? These guys are gross. But it's very easy to get around that by just adding lightning damage. Piece of cake. And even without going for the Widow constellation and getting that arcane bomb to reduce their lightning damage earlier, even without her, you're doing an extra 15% damage because the celestial presence of your guardians by itself is bringing that down to negative 15%, which means you're doing 15% more damage. Okay? Roughly. That's not the exact formula, obviously, but we're not going to get into the weeds on that one because that's not really important right now. We're talking about building. Right? Now, the one word of warning I have for improving Shieldbreaker, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is even if you are adjusting your build on the fly, there's one line you're going to have a really hard time crossing unless you cross the line supremely early. And that is the physical to the fire damage line, alright? Because again, remember, physical damage and bleed, which is why we use it as our secondary damage source in that instance, they both scale off cunning. Fire and lightning, which is the reason why we use that as the secondary damage source for fire, both scale off of spirit. So unless you are changing your primary damage type over to the other side very early on in your character, this is really hard to pull off. Okay? So be very careful if you're making that change. You might be shooting yourself in the foot if you do that late enough. Alright? But, generally speaking, regardless of how you're rolling your builds, right, how you want to roll this, you're looking for some variation of points in Presence of Virtue. Minimum 1, my average is 3. Okay? You want Divine Mandate, that's always going to be useful regardless of which build you're going for, so is Celestial Presence. Another standout skill is in all of these, even the ranged ones, stun jacks into full spread can be very, very nice. For ranged builds, they can throw it at a distance and stun potentially multiple targets, or they can use it as one single attack right before they dodge away from a melee range enemy. Either of these are great uses for stun jacks with ranged. Obviously, melee enemies are going to be just throwing the whole stun jacks right into the face of the target. Very damaging, right? That is an option. You will want either Fire Strike or Righteous Fervor. Righteous Fervor is slightly better in those situations in which you are either tackling unusually difficult foes because a mod has increased their stat numbers, or you're playing hardcore. But for generalized gameplay, I have a mild preference for Fire Strike, but Fire Strike is much more important in any modded game that increases enemy numbers on screen. Right? Vindictive Flame is something you primarily want to be using on melee classes, melee builds. This, specifically, is most useful in melee because it is actually actively burning and damaging enemies adjacent to you while increasing your attack speed, which also allows Fire Strike or Righteous Fervor to proc more often. Right? If you're ranged, Granado is going to be a really big deal. Both of these remain equally as relevant whether you're going for a physical or an elemental run, right? If you're going for a physical or elemental, Vindictive Flame doesn't really change. It does both physical and fire damage, right? That's fine. Granado, you just have to put a single point into Skyfire Granado to make that change very easily, and since both are on the way to the very useful Static Strike for ranged weapons, which is another reason why I would recommend Fire Strike with ranged weapons specifically, in most cases, it's not really that difficult to get Skyfire Granado at all. It's not at all out of your way, right? Melee obviously can use Eye of Reckoning. And a lot of people don't talk about it, but because of the existence of Safeguard, it's not an entirely bad idea to run Eye of Reckoning in conjunction with an Offhand. That is totally something you can do. Okay, that is decently effective. And Offhand is a little bit better at this, in my opinion. Again, this is because most Offhands run really impressive levels of damage, right? But just keep that in mind that it is something that you can do, right? You can, any melee run can do this, right? It's fine. Normally, for something like this, I might recommend a specific one, but two-handed melee is effective. Shield with melee is effective. Offhand with melee is effective. Go ham. Virus Might is unusual in any of these where you can fully use it in the damage type you're focusing on. You can do full physical by just not including Volcanic Might or Volcanic Stride. Okay? If you're doing the Elemental, you can full convert this to Elemental, basically, by running Volcanic Might, although the internal trauma damage stays, but that's beside the point, and Volcanic Stride. Very easy, right? Aegis of Men here is surprisingly effective with a shield gun, a gun with shield, because it helps keep enemies away. Works excellently in conjunction with Static Strike and Granado. Whether you're doing the physical or the elemental version, this is going to be fairly consistent either way. Okay? Judgment is something you primarily want to be using as a melee tank type thing with allies. Why not recommend it for single player? Well, let me get into that really quickly in this brief recap. You see, Judgment is primarily used for bringing targets to yourself. This isn't really a problem with the Shieldbreaker. You're the only, in a single player game, you're the only target there, other than the rare occasion of where invincible allies are helping you out. Well, mostly invincible, but anyways. NPC allies are not hitting that hard anyways, so they don't really matter. You don't really need to pull in or taunt enemies when you're by yourself. You are the only target, right? And even though Judgment does do some decent physical damage, and it's easy to grab additional physical damage with Crushing Verdict, unless you're really specifically looking for that taunt feature, because this doesn't scale with weapon damage or add your shield in here, this is running purely off of your equipment in terms of stat boosting, and obviously, of course, Divine Mandate and your constellations. This doesn't have that same kind of longevity that something like Virus Might has, which does 230% additional weapon damage and adds the shield's damage, right? Aegis of Men here. Shield plus weapon damage, right? Well, technically it's the shield's damage because the shield is counting as a weapon here, but, right? Fire Strike. Righteous Fervor. Weapon damage. Even if you use stun jacks, it's not your primary damage, right? It's just a really nice to have for either the stun or impressive damage in melee range. So that's, the word on Judgment there, right? Ascension is only really extremely nice with either a shield, because you're getting usually more retaliation damage out of those constellations because they tend to go hand in hand, or for hardcore, right? Resilience I like all the time. It's just a broadly effective item. Presence of Virtue depends on your needs at the time in terms of energy regeneration. You only really need Haven with a shield. You only really need Rebuke when facing off against very specific bosses. There's the bug in the cave on the Path of the Three thing there. I can't remember her name. She's a Maptherin. Great against her. A couple of other life drain post-game bosses that can do that as well. Rebuke is decent against those. Very specific situation for that. Same thing for this, right? Very similarly specific situation. Same situations, actually. So that is a sort of brief overcap. If you're going physical, it's best to go shield with melee because you have access to Shattering Smash, of course. If you have a shield, it's best to use Safeguard because no matter how you roll, this is going to boost you, right? But with all of that being said, quite gloriously, I hope you enjoyed this more thorough view of the Shieldbreaker, their devotions, how I approach this for real, why I advocate for 2 different damage types in most situations, the caveat to that and why people don't like it, and some ideas for your next improv build. I hope this helped with all of these and more. But with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. And if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me. And I'm going to be taking this more seriously from now on, so you have that to look forward to. But with that being said, enjoy the next 24 hours.